When a nation rises to assert itself, the move cannot be seen as a simple, impulsive reaction to some external force. It is instead a process, one rooted deeply in discipline, foresight, and an ordered vision of the future. India's decision to strike back reflects not the chaotic impulse of aggression, but the cultivated strength of a system that has understood both its vulnerabilities and its possibilities. Chaos is ever present. It lurks in the uncertainty of global politics, in the shifting alliances, in the voices that try to dominate weaker ones. Yet, what distinguishes true strength from hollow noise is the ability to transform chaos into structured order. This transformation does not come accidentally, but only through years, even decades, of deliberate preparation. To respond with conviction requires a foundation that has been laid brick by brick, through sacrifice, resilience, and clarity. A society, much like an individual, cannot act meaningfully without first establishing a framework of principles. And when order emerges in the face of chaos, it radiates strength that others cannot help but notice. It's tempting to view power as raw force, as the capacity to inflict damage or to impose one's will upon another. But force without order collapses back into chaos. It is unsustainable, reckless, and ultimately destructive even to the one wielding it. India's strike is not merely the projection of military capacity, but the manifestation of disciplined restraint that knows when to act and why. It represents the principle that order, when structured correctly, can harness chaos rather than be consumed by it. Nations that act impulsively burn bright for a moment but crumble quickly under the weight of disorganization. In contrast, those that align their values, their institutions, and their sense of identity create actions that echo far beyond the immediate moment. This is what separates a calculated response from a desperate lash-out. The order behind the action is what grants it legitimacy. And legitimacy, in geopolitics as in life, is what sustains power in the long run. Consider the individual who allows their life to fall into disorder, who drifts aimlessly without anchoring principles or a sense of responsibility. They may lash out at the world, scream against injustice, or blame others for their misfortune, but such reactions do little to strengthen them. They are expressions of chaos masquerading as strength. Only when that individual begins to discipline their own habits, clarify their values, and take responsibility for their actions, do they begin to generate real influence. Nations are no different. India's response symbolizes the same principle at scale: order before action, structure before assertion, meaning before noise. Without order, power collapses into brutality. With order, it transforms into strength, recognized and respected. And the recognition of that strength does not come only from outside, but also from within. It reinforces the confidence of a people to believe in themselves, to see their nation not as fragile, but as resilient. This is the essence of why strength emerges from order, not chaos. Order is not easy to achieve. In fact, it is one of the most difficult undertakings in both personal and collective life. Chaos is natural. It is what happens when no effort is made, when entropy is left unchecked, when things drift as they will. To impose order requires discipline, the willingness to sacrifice immediate pleasures for the sake of long-term stability. India, in deciding to strike back, demonstrates the fruit of such discipline. It has chosen not to be a passive observer in a chaotic world, but to act as a structured force within it. The act itself is not isolated. It reflects a deeper process of building institutions, strengthening systems, and instilling a collective will that prioritizes coherence over collapse. This is why such actions shock the world, because the world is more accustomed to chaos than to structured defiance. The shock is not merely at the strike itself, but at the disciplined order that made it possible. and that is far more unsettling to those who thrive on disorder. We can understand this principle by reflecting on history, which is littered with examples of nations that rose quickly on the back of chaos, but fell just as swiftly. Revolutions that promised the world but dissolved into tyranny, movements that began with fire but ended in ash. Their failure was not in their ambition, but in their lack of order. The absence of a framework to channel their energy into something sustainable. India's rise in this moment is therefore not simply about military or political assertion. It is about demonstrating the value of order over time. By cultivating internal resilience, it shows that the true foundation of power is not immediate dominance, but the capacity to sustain action through structure. This principle is universal. Whether in personal life, in communities, or in nations, only order gives rise to strength that endures. Without it, the noise of chaos inevitably swallows the fleeting voice of the impulsive. There is also a psychological dimension to this principle that is worth exploring. Human beings are not naturally inclined toward order. Our instincts pull us toward comfort, avoidance, and distraction. It is precisely because chaos is easier that order must be consciously pursued. Nations, like individuals, fall prey to the temptation of inertia, the comfort of avoiding hard decisions, the seduction of short-term relief at the cost of long-term security. But the price of such avoidance is steep. India's choice to act in defiance of chaos signals a psychological maturity, the willingness to confront discomfort, risk criticism, and bear the burden of responsibility. This mirrors the same inner battle each individual faces daily. Do you remain passive in the face of chaos, or do you take the difficult path of structuring your existence? Strength is born in the latter, never the former. The idea that order precedes strength also challenges our understanding of freedom. Too often, freedom is confused with the absence of restriction, the ability to do as one pleases without consequence. But such freedom, unchecked, collapses into chaos. True freedom requires boundaries, structure, and responsibility. It is within ordered frameworks that people and nations find the capacity to act meaningfully. India's assertion is not a chaotic pursuit of reckless freedom. It is a structured claim of sovereignty, framed within a disciplined understanding of responsibility. This is why it holds weight on the global stage, because it embodies the paradox that freedom without order is destructive, but freedom within order is powerful. And it is precisely this balance that distinguishes true strength from mere force. Order also carries with it a moral dimension, for it is impossible to speak of structured action without invoking questions of right and wrong. Chaos blurs morality. It makes everything arbitrary, relative, and subject to the whims of power. But order demands clarity. It forces a nation to ask, what do we stand for, and why? India's willingness to strike back does not emerge from a vacuum, but from a moral conviction rooted in its sense of identity and responsibility. To act without order would be to descend into the same arbitrariness that plagues much of global politics. But to act with order is to anchor strength in meaning, to assert not only capability but purpose. And when strength is aligned with purpose, it cannot be dismissed as mere provocation. It becomes a statement of being. This is why such actions resonate so deeply, even beyond the immediate political consequences. Finally, the emergence of strength from order highlights a truth that extends beyond geopolitics and into the core of human existence. Life itself is a struggle between chaos and order, between the forces that dissolve meaning and those that construct it. Nations, much like individuals, are constantly choosing which of these forces to align with. India's strike back serves as a reminder that the path to strength is not found in surrendering to chaos, but in disciplining it, structuring it, and bending it toward meaningful ends. This lesson applies to anyone seeking resilience in their own life, You cannot afford to remain in disorder and expect strength to arise. Strength is earned painstakingly through the construction of order, and when order finally stands tall, chaos has no choice but to recoil. A nation that does not know who it is cannot possibly survive the turbulence of history. Identity is not an accessory, it is the very foundation of existence. When India asserts itself against the pressures of global powers, it is declaring something profound, that its identity cannot and will not be negotiated away. The same applies to each of us at the individual level. If you do not know who you are, then you are at the mercy of anyone who tells you who you should be. This is not just a matter of politics or culture, but of psychological survival. To abandon identity is to dissolve into chaos, where no direction can be trusted and no foundation can be relied upon. Nations that forget their identity become colonies of stronger wills, puppets of louder voices, shadows of themselves. And in the same way, individuals without identity are prey to manipulation, lost in a world where everything is imposed upon them. Identity is not constructed overnight, nor is it a fragile ornament that can be put on or taken off depending on the circumstances. It is forged through centuries of struggle, through countless sacrifices, through traditions that anchor the present to the weight of the past. India's refusal to bend before external pressure reflects this deep history. It is the assertion of a civilization that has survived invasions, colonization, and countless attempts to erase its character. To stand tall in such a moment is not arrogance but recognition of truth. The lesson here is universal. Strength cannot emerge from pretending to be someone else. If you live your life trying to appease everyone, to fit into identities imposed by others, you will never develop a core that is truly your own. Nations that compromise their identities for approval lose the respect they seek. Likewise, individuals who abandon themselves to please others lose the dignity they need. The negotiation of identity is a dangerous temptation because it seems easier than conflict. It seems safer to comply, to conform, to silence yourself in order to avoid resistance. But every time you negotiate away a piece of who you are, you lose more than you realize. India's strike back is a refusal to participate in that slow erosion of selfhood. It is the same principle that applies when an individual finally decides to say, "This is who I am, and I will not apologize for existing." That act of declaration shocks those who benefited from your silence, because they never expected resistance. Nations and individuals alike are pressured to compromise until nothing remains of them but fragments. To resist is costly, but to comply is fatal. What India has demonstrated is that the preservation of identity is worth any price. And the same lesson is there for each person. Your identity must be guarded, or you will be consumed. Consider the psychological damage that occurs when someone lives against their own nature. The constant suppression of true thoughts, values, and convictions produces bitterness, resentment, and weakness. At first, the individual believes they are keeping the peace, avoiding unnecessary conflict. But over time, the cost of denying identity accumulates, and what remains is a hollow shell incapable of genuine strength. Nations experience the same decline when they allow external forces to dictate their character. India's assertion is the opposite of this decline. It is the reclamation of strength through identity. It is saying, we will no longer accept being defined by others. The courage required for this is immense, because standing in identity inevitably invites resistance. Yet, paradoxically, it is only through embracing identity that true respect is earned. For respect is never granted to those who compromise endlessly. It is granted to those who refuse to compromise at all. The world often disguises its demands for conformity as diplomacy, cooperation, or partnership. But behind those demands lies a subtle pressure. Abandon who you are in exchange for acceptance. Individuals face the same challenge in their lives. Every social environment, workplaces, friendships, institutions demands conformity at some level. The danger lies not in adapting behavior, but in surrendering essence. India's decision to strike back reflects a refusal to surrender essence. It's not about rejecting dialogue or rejecting cooperation. It's about refusing to erase oneself in the process. This is a model of courage that can be mirrored in personal life. When you learn to say no to the pressures that demand you become someone else, you discover strength you didn't know existed. The price of such defiance is high, but the reward is authenticity, and authenticity is the only foundation upon which lasting strength can be built. What makes identity so powerful is that it unifies the past, the present, and the future into a single, coherent narrative. Without identity, everything fragments. The past becomes irrelevant, the future becomes meaningless, and the present collapses into chaos. For India, to strike back is to assert a continuous story, to declare that its future will not be dictated by those who misunderstand its past. For the individual, the principle is the same. Identity connects who you were with who you are and who you intend to become. Without this thread, life feels arbitrary and meaningless. That is why so many people feel lost when they neglect the development of their own identity. They have cut themselves off from continuity. Nations that fall into this trap become pawns, tossed about by stronger powers. Individuals who fall into it become directionless, dependent on others to tell them what to do. Only identity provides the stability to resist chaos. The danger of losing identity is not only weakness, but also exploitation. When others sense that you do not know who you are, they will define you for their own advantage. They will use your uncertainty to manipulate you, to reduce you into something that serves their purposes. History is full of nations that fell into this trap, allowing themselves to be reshaped until nothing of their original essence remained. India's decision to assert its identity is a warning against such exploitation. It is saying, we define ourselves, not you. On the personal level, this is the same as rejecting manipulation in relationships, workplaces, and social circles. If you don't define yourself, others will, and they will do it poorly. Identity, then, becomes not only a matter of pride, but of survival. It protects you against exploitation by giving you an unshakable anchor that others cannot move. The process of guarding identity requires sacrifice, because every act of resistance is costly. You cannot declare who you are without facing criticism, opposition, and attempts to silence you. This is why many people and nations hesitate, preferring the temporary comfort of compromise to the pain of conflict. But compromise chips away at identity until nothing remains. India's response demonstrates a different path, choosing the harder road of resistance to preserve the core of who you are. This path is not comfortable, and it never will be. But comfort is not the goal, truth is, and truth is inseparable from identity. For an individual, the same reality applies. If you want to live authentically, you must prepare to face resistance. You must decide that the preservation of who you are is worth more than the approval of those who demand your silence. Identity also carries with it responsibility, because to claim who you are means accepting the consequences of that claim. India, in striking back, does not simply assert independence. It assumes the responsibility of living out that independence. To say we are is to also say we must. For the individual, identity is not a static possession but an ongoing duty. If you declare yourself to be honest, you must act honestly. If you declare yourself to be courageous, you must act courageously. Identity, once claimed, requires discipline to sustain. This is why so many avoid it. They fear the burden. Yet, it is precisely this burden that transforms life into something meaningful. Without the weight of responsibility, identity becomes an empty word. But when responsibility is embraced, identity becomes a source of inexhaustible strength. Power is so often misunderstood as the ability to dominate, to control, to impose one's will on others. This is a primitive and superficial conception of power, one that fails the test of time and corrupts those who wield it. Real power, as demonstrated in moments like India's assertion against the West, is something different entirely. It is the acceptance of responsibility. Responsibility transforms strength from mere force into something meaningful, into something that sustains rather than destroys. A person who dominates others through fear may seem powerful, but that power collapses as soon as resistance grows too strong. By contrast, a person who takes responsibility creates trust, stability, and a foundation that endures. Nations operate under the same principle. Dominance may terrify for a moment, but responsibility inspires respect for generations. India's actions resonate because they emerge from a position of responsibility rather than recklessness. That distinction makes all the difference. When you consider what responsibility means, it is not glamorous, nor is it easy. Responsibility is the willingness to carry burdens, to accept limits, and to confront reality even when it is uncomfortable. It demands sacrifice of immediate gratification for the sake of long-term stability and integrity. In personal life, responsibility means showing up when you don't feel like it, telling the truth when lying would be easier, carrying the weight of others when they cannot carry it themselves. For nations, it means safeguarding sovereignty, protecting citizens, and upholding values even when pressured to compromise. India's strike is not just an act of power, it is the weight of responsibility manifesting itself. The message is, we will bear the cost to protect our people, our dignity, and our future. This is what separates nations that endure from those that collapse under their own irresponsibility. Power without responsibility is a weapon. Power with responsibility is leadership. The difference between domination and responsibility becomes clearer when we examine their consequences over time. Domination provokes resentment, resistance, and eventual rebellion. Those who are dominated eventually find ways to fight back, and when they do, the edifice of domination collapses. Responsibility, however, creates order, loyalty, and mutual respect. When India asserts itself responsibly, it signals not a hunger for conquest but a devotion to its obligations as a sovereign nation. That devotion commands respect even from those who may not agree with its actions. On the personal level, the same is true. Domination in relationships breeds hatred. Responsibility nurtures trust. A life lived in domination becomes lonely and corrupt, while a life lived in responsibility becomes meaningful and respected. Strength, when rooted in responsibility, becomes unshakable because it is aligned with something higher than mere self-interest. Responsibility also requires a confrontation with chaos, for it is in chaos that true character is tested. To act responsibly means to look into the disorder of the world and voluntarily shoulder what can be carried. This is no small feat. It demands courage, sacrifice, and often suffering. India, by standing against pressure, has taken on the chaos of uncertainty, knowing that resistance invites conflict, but choosing it nonetheless. The same is true for individuals. When you take responsibility, you accept that the path ahead will be harder, but also more meaningful. The temptation is always to avoid responsibility, to blame others, to shrink from duty. But avoidance only feeds chaos. and makes it grow. Responsibility shrinks chaos into something manageable, into something that can be ordered. It transforms the unbearable into something that can be endured. In this way, responsibility becomes the cornerstone of authentic power. The world is full of examples of those who pursued domination instead of responsibility, and their stories nearly always end the same. Dictators, tyrants, leaders who ruled by fear. All of them seemed powerful in the short term, but left behind ruins in the long term. Their power was hollow, built on sand, because it lacked the foundation of responsibility. India's example illustrates the alternative path, a power built on carrying burdens rather than imposing them. This is why it shocks the world. It does not fit into the old paradigm of domination. Instead, it speaks to a new kind of power, one that demands respect because it is aligned with responsibility rather than greed. For individuals, the parallel is clear. If you build your life on domination over others, over circumstances, you may rise quickly, but you will fall just as quickly. If you build it on responsibility, you may rise slowly, but you will endure. Responsibility also transforms the individual by giving life weight, and with that weight comes meaning. Many people suffer not because life is too hard, but because life feels too meaningless. They avoid responsibility, thinking it will lighten their burden, but what they are left with is emptiness. Responsibility adds weight, but it also provides direction. India, by accepting the weight of responsibility, gives its actions meaning that domination could never provide. The individual, too, must learn this lesson, that it is precisely in carrying the heaviest load you can bear that you find purpose. Without responsibility, power is empty. Without responsibility, freedom is shallow. The paradox is that in taking on more responsibility, life becomes more bearable, not less, because you discover meaning in the struggle itself. That meaning is the antidote to chaos, despair, and hopelessness. At the deepest level, responsibility is a moral principle, because it places the needs of others alongside your own. Domination seeks only the self. Responsibility recognizes the weight of the collective. For nations, this means understanding that sovereignty is not only about self-interest, but about duty to citizens and to future generations. For individuals, it means acknowledging that your actions affect others, that your existence carries obligations whether you choose them or not. India's willingness to act responsibly shows that true power is not selfish, it is bound to duty. This is what elevates action from mere force to moral strength. And moral strength, unlike domination, cannot be easily broken. It endures because it aligns with truth. To act responsibly is to align yourself with the structure of reality itself, and that alignment gives you stability even under immense pressure. There is, of course, a cost to responsibility. To carry burdens is painful, to accept duty is difficult, and to bear the weight of consequence is exhausting. This is why so many abandon it, preferring the illusion of domination or the comfort of avoidance. But the cost of shirking responsibility is always greater in the end, because it leaves chaos unchecked and meaning absent. India's strike shows a willingness to pay the cost of responsibility rather than escape it. It demonstrates the universal truth that anything meaningful comes at a price. For the individual, the same applies. If you want strength, if you want respect, if you want purpose, you must be willing to pay the price of responsibility. And though the cost is high, the reward is immeasurable. That reward is not comfort but significance. It is the kind of strength that dominates nothing but sustains everything. When responsibility becomes the foundation of action, both nations and individuals rise to their highest potential. It is the difference between a tyrant and a leader, between a coward and a hero, between chaos and order. India, by demonstrating responsibility in its assertion, sets an example of what authentic power looks like. It is not loud, it is not reckless, and it is not arbitrary. It is deliberate, grounded, and aligned with duty. The same holds true for every person who seeks to live meaningfully. If you orient your life toward responsibility, you will find a strength that does not waver, a power that does not corrupt, and a dignity that no one can take away. Responsibility transforms everything it touches, turning fragile force into enduring power, and fragile lives into meaningful ones. It is in this transformation that the true essence of power reveals itself. What a nation demonstrates on the world stage is rarely different from what an individual must demonstrate in personal life. The patterns of human existence scale upward into politics, into culture, into the destiny of entire civilizations. When India strikes back, refusing to be cowed or silenced, it reflects the same psychological process that occurs when a person finally decides to speak with conviction. For years, a voice may remain quiet, suppressed by fear or hesitation, and the world grows accustomed to that silence. But the moment resistance is born, the environment must reorganize itself around it. Nations, like people, send ripples through reality when they choose courage over passivity. That choice unsettles the forces that relied upon weakness, because it introduces a new axis of strength. This is why India's defiance shocks the world. It mirrors the universal truth that courage reorganizes the playing field entirely. The idea that the individual mirrors the nation is not abstract philosophy. It is concrete reality. History is written not by faceless entities, but by human beings whose psychology shapes their nation's actions. Just as an individual must take responsibility for who they are, so too must a nation. Just as a person must decide when enough is enough, so must a country. India's declaration of self-respect and sovereignty is no different from an individual finally saying no to endless exploitation. This is not merely a geopolitical strategy. It is the assertion of being itself. And that assertion forces the world to recalibrate, because once identity is claimed, it cannot be ignored. You see this mirrored in ordinary life. When someone timid finds their voice, the entire dynamic of their relationships shifts. What was tolerated before becomes intolerable. What was overlooked becomes impossible to dismiss. This parallel between the individual and the nation should not be taken lightly, because it reveals the fundamental unity of human existence. The structures that govern nations are larger in scale, but not different in kind from the structures that govern a single life. If you remain silent, people will walk over you. If you refuse to take a stand, others will dictate your path. Nations experience the same reality. Silence invites dominance, weakness invites exploitation, hesitation invites manipulation. India's willingness to stand tall and strike back reflects a principle that each of us must internalize. Speak truth when it matters most, or lose the ground beneath you. That act of courage transforms perception itself. The weak voice becomes strong, and once it is strong, it commands respect. Nations rise in exactly the same way individuals rise, through clarity, courage, and conviction. It is important to recognize that such courage does not emerge spontaneously. It is built through discipline, through countless small decisions to speak honestly and act responsibly when it would be easier not to. Nations do not suddenly grow strong. They are forged over decades of resilience, just as individuals are forged through years of struggle. India's response, shocking though it may be, is the culmination of long preparation, of internal growth, of collective endurance. The same truth applies to the individual. Courage is cultivated, not conjured. Each act of standing up to fear prepares you for greater tests in the future. Each refusal to compromise your values strengthens the foundation of your identity. By the time the great test arrives, you are no longer weak, because you have already learned to live with strength. Nations prove themselves in precisely the same way, by refusing to bend until bending becomes impossible. What happens when an individual finally asserts themselves after years of silence? The people around them are startled, sometimes even outraged. They had grown accustomed to submission, and the sudden presence of resistance feels like an act of rebellion. The same happens when a nation like India pushes back against global pressure. The world is caught off guard, but this shock is necessary because it disrupts the imbalance of power that had become normalized. People who benefit from your weakness will always resent your strength, but that does not make strength illegitimate. On the contrary, it makes it all the more necessary. For both nations and individuals, this shift in dynamics is the beginning of transformation. It may be uncomfortable, but it is the discomfort of growth, the disruption that makes way for renewal. Courage always disrupts, but disruption is the price of freedom. The mirror between the nation and the individual also highlights the role of responsibility in courage. To speak with conviction is not to lash out recklessly, but to carry the burden of truth. When India strikes back, it does so not as a child throwing a tantrum, but as an adult taking responsibility for its sovereignty. This is the difference between chaos and order, between noise and meaning. Likewise, when an individual finally asserts themselves, it must not be out of spite or pettiness, but out of alignment with responsibility. True courage is responsible courage. It carries weight and demands discipline. That is why it commands respect, even from those who oppose it. Empty defiance collapses under scrutiny, but responsible conviction endures. Nations that understand this principle gain influence not through domination but through integrity, and individuals who embody it gain respect not through force but through authenticity. The psychological transformation that comes with courage cannot be overstated. Before courage, the world feels overwhelming, oppressive, impossible to navigate. After courage, the same world reorganizes itself into something manageable, something open to influence. India's action demonstrates this shift at scale, the move from being dictated to dictating terms of its own. The same shift occurs when a person stops living passively and begins asserting their will. Suddenly, options appear that seemed invisible before, relationships recalibrate, and possibilities emerge. Courage does not remove difficulty, but it transforms how difficulty is encountered. It changes the posture of existence from victimhood to agency. Nations and individuals alike are defined not by the absence of struggle, but by the manner in which they face it. Courage is the pivot point, the moment of transformation, where existence takes on a new and stronger form. The world, whether at the scale of nations or individuals, respects those who respect themselves. Weakness invites pity at best, contempt at worst, but self-respect commands recognition. India's decision to assert its dignity is precisely that, an act of self-respect that the world cannot ignore. And the lesson is just as applicable to a single human life. If you fail to respect yourself, you invite others to dismiss you, to use you, to shape you into something convenient for them. But if you stand firmly in your dignity, others must recalibrate their treatment of you. Self-respect is contagious. It compels others to respond in kind. Nations that demonstrate self-respect set the tone for how they are treated globally. Individuals who embody self-respect set the tone for how they are treated personally. This is the reflection, the mirror, between the nation and the individual. In the end, the principle is simple though difficult to embody. The courage of one scales into the courage of many. When an individual asserts themselves, they inspire others to do the same. When a nation asserts itself, it reshapes the balance of the global order. India's strike back is not only about geopolitics. It is about demonstrating the universal truth that strength arises when clarity and conviction meet courage. The same truth lies at the heart of individual transformation. Each of us carries the responsibility to embody the strength we wish to see at larger scales. Nations are collections of individuals, and the strength of a nation is ultimately the strength of its people. Courage at the personal level builds courage at the collective level, and courage at the collective level reshapes the destiny of the world itself.